My guest today is the writer of Excellent Cadavers, which I'm trying to hold up right here in front of me, and the death of the first Mafia Republic. And how did it end up with the title before it started of Excellent Cadavers, and how did you end up studying the Mafia in the first place?
Well, there are two parts to that. The term Excellent Cadavers refers to, it's an echo of a novel by the great Sicilian novelist Leonardo Sciascia, whom I greatly admire. And it became a term that was used to describe a particular kind of mafia killing, when the mafia killed someone important, someone in power. That was known as an excellent cadaver. Rather than just the normal dead body that would turn up in the course of a criminal case. And that seemed an evocative, important title because one of the things that distinguishes the mafia from other forms of crime is its relationship to power and its ability to draw on institutional power and people in legitimate business and politics to gain both protection and power. And so in the particular story that I tell in this book, there are an incredible number of excellent cadavers. The mafia, in a period between, particularly in the early 80s into the early 90s, killed an astonishing number of important people in Sicily, virtually everyone who tried to contrast mafia power in Sicily, from the governor of Sicily to two chief prosecutors of Palermo, numerous police investigators, a national general of the Carabinieri, and then the two prosecutors who are the central characters of the book, Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. So excellent cadavers figure very heavily in the book, but they also convey this idea of the relationship between power, political power, and mafia. The subtitle, the Mafia and the Death of the First Italian Republic, refers to a set of political changes that was happening right around, well, certainly when I was writing the book, but also right around the time in which my two main characters were killed. It's one of the main sort of theses of the book that these assassinations come about at a time of epochal change in Italian life. They're both killed in 1992. 1992 is the moment that the Maastricht Treaty goes into effect. Italy enters a economically united Europe. It also is a time in which a huge corruption investigation in northern Italy begins, known as Operation Clean Hands. And it is the beginning of a period of radical change in Italian political life, in which political order, which had existed from World War II up until that point, begins to break down. And so it's one of the main arguments of this book, that the war against the mafia is heavily conditioned by the political conditions that existed in the First Italian Republic, in other words, the republic that follows World War II, and that breaks down in the early 90s, which leads to a kind of violent reaction on the part of the mafia that includes the killing of these prosecutors, and it ends up wiping out the political parties that had coexisted with the mafia, protected the mafia to some degree, and there was a relationship of collusion between the established political parties and the mafia in Sicily, but also other parts of southern Italy. So I wanted to kind of allude to that in the subtitle.
What makes the mafia so much more famous than, let's say, other organized crime organizations? And obviously Hollywood has a lot to do with this, but is it just Hollywood, or is there much more that makes the mafia so much more famous than other organizations?
Probably some of both. The term mafia is first used in the middle of the 19th century when Italy is unifying as a country, and Garibaldi leads a shipload of soldiers down to southern Italy and joins Sicily to what is beginning to be a kind of unified Italy. And as northern soldiers and northern bureaucrats begin to try to organize life down in Sicily, they encounter a kind of crime that they hadn't encountered before. They encounter a kind of crime that was very stubborn and difficult to deal with, in which the criminals would seem to enjoy an unusual degree of protection and impunity. Common criminals would seem to know people in the Sicilian nobility. There would be evidence against them, but they'd be acquitted at trial. You couldn't get witnesses to testify against them. So they began to use this term mafia. So it was encountered most in Sicily and was probably strongest in Sicily, although the Camorra in Naples was also very powerful and noted by these same kind of northern government officials in that same period.
Sicily was kind of hesitant to join Italy as a unified country, right?
Yes, although that's hard to measure. There was a referendum that took place after Garibaldi took Sicily, and if you go to the town hall in Palermo, you'll see carved into stone the results of this plebiscite or referendum that took place. And the referendum shows something like 98% of Sicilians voting in favor of joining Italy. It's very unlikely that actually reflected real public opinion at the time. In fact, the great Sicilian novelist Giuseppe di Lampedusa, in the book The Gattopardo, The Leopard, remarks very sarcastically about this referendum as an indication that Italian democracy was not what it was cracked up to be, and that this referendum was, kind of staged or gave a false impression. Probably most Sicilians were indifferent to whether they were part of unified Italy or the so-called Kingdom of the Two Sicilies that was governed by the Bourbon kings. I think what's fair to say is that at a certain point, the unification of Italy came to feel a little bit like northern domination to many Sicilians, but many Sicilians embraced the idea of unification because they saw it as an avenue toward progress, modernization, and so on. The tragedy of this story and of Sicily generally is that the process of unification was a very incomplete one, and the Sicilians didn't get a lot of the benefits of being part of a unified state.
Is that what allowed crime to flourish in Sicily in the first place?
Yes. I mean, to kind of take a step backward and to explain how the mafia came to exist in the first place, you have to imagine that in the first half of the 19th century, Sicily is run by a small number of aristocratic families who own many large estates. These aristocrats live in fancy palaces in Palermo or even in Naples, which has been the capital of the Kingdom of Two Sicilies. These estates are run by sort of estate managers who are there locally. The peasants who actually farm the land have almost no power and no rights. And justice is handed out in a rather rough and ready fashion, in many cases by armed guards who guard these estates and collect the proceeds of the estates. What happens is, and during this period, which is really almost feudal in nature, it is literally illegal to sell land in Sicily up until the first decades of the 19th century. So you have a kind of situation of an economy that's frozen in a feudal system. It's a little bit like what the Soviet Union was before Glasnost and Perestroika. Then suddenly you open up this economy. Land becomes something that you can buy and sell. And you have these large estates that are run from a distance by aristocratic owners, but run in practice. The actual physical control of the estates is in the hands of these camp guards, who are people with shotguns and little armed, people who help them do their work. These people are thought to have been kind of the first mafiosi, people who are in a position to actually physically control the land. And as land becomes available for sale, in some cases, they move in and they take advantage of some of the opportunities to a situation in which there's a kind of, suddenly you introduce capitalism into an area of great wealth, but very few administrative controls and little tradition of rule of law. And so you suddenly see these cases that the Northerners who began trying to govern Sicily noted in their reports in the 1860s and 70s, where an aristocrat would visit his estate in rural Sicily and be actually held prisoner and kidnapped by his own armed guards, and then suddenly sell off a piece of the land to one of these characters. So the mafia gets its origin in a kind of disorderly introduction of capitalism into what was a static feudal society. In that way, as I said, it kind of resembles what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in which suddenly you introduce a kind of savage capitalism into a place that hadn't known it, and it becomes the law of the jungle, in which
the Wild West.
Yeah, the strongest predator ends up taking the bounty. So that was what was happening in the second half of the 19th century, when these groups kind of began to flex their muscles and make themselves known. And, then it changes over time. The other thing that is interesting and worth noting is that the mafia has generally coexisted with democracy. Democracy, to some degree, favored the establishment of mafia-type groups because it was a way of securing political protection and power. These people were powerful figures in their communities, and among the things they had in their power was to move votes in one direction or another. And so a person in power, somebody, remember that in the late 19th century in Italy, a small percentage of people, only a small percentage of the population actually had the right to vote. So if you could move a few hundred votes in the direction of this or that candidate, you could become quite a powerful figure. So these mafia figures were often in a position to be political power brokers, and therefore, if they got into trouble, were under investigation, that politician could intervene and have a police investigator transferred to another area, have an investigation quashed, have somebody released on bail, that kind of thing. So that's
now we talked about this a little bit earlier, and I'm not sure if that was you about to mention, but would you call Mafia unnecessary evil?
Pardon me?
Would you call the Mafia unnecessary evil?
No, I wouldn't. There's nothing necessary about it. It's. I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that the Mafia is a product of history, and like anything in history, it has a beginning and an end. It's the product of a specific set of circumstances that arose. The Giovanni Falcone, one of the main characters of my book, said, the Mafia is a human phenomenon, and like human phenomena, has a beginning and an end. And so I think this idea that the Mafia, this was something that even in the early 1980s, some Italian politicians would say, we just need to keep the Mafia within its natural physiological limits, as if it were something that was inevitable, or what you were saying, a necessary evil. That's essentially capitulating to the idea that the Mafia will be a powerful force in society. So the question is...
In the Japanese government kind of do this to, I believe, Yakuza. It's a Japanese organized crime family.
That may be. I don't know enough about the Yakuza to make a comment on that. But obviously, political powers in lots of places have found it convenient to come to terms with organized crime people rather than fight them very hard. You can see that, for example, in somewhere like Mexico, the attempt of a recent Mexican president to conduct a war against narco-traffickers ended up leading to a total bloodbath. So obviously it's complicated, but the fact is that it's one of the kind of main theses of my book, that when the Italian state has been determined and united in combating the Mafia, it can be quite effective. The Mafia has enjoyed a kind of myth of invincibility that has benefited it and led in many cases to judges and police officials just sort of throwing up their hands and deciding, well, they mostly kill criminals, so let's not get too worried about it. And I think that's a huge mistake, because the Mafia phenomenon in Sicily, but also in other parts of southern Italy, has led to a kind of permanent underdevelopment of that region, has stunted the life possibilities of the people that live in that region. To give you a little bit of an idea of what I'm talking about, I have a friend who lives now in New York, who grew up in a town called Torre Annunziata outside of Naples, and his father ran a nice hotel in the area. And when his father died, he expected to take over the hotel and run it. And within about a week of inheriting this property, he found himself with a gun to his head, in which a local gangster was explaining to him where he would need to, launder his linen, where he would need to buy his towels, where he would need to do this and that. And he decided to sell the hotel and get out of there, because he didn't want to live in this fashion. So that tells you what a smart, ambitious young person, how they, perceive their options operating in a world in which these people are the most powerful players in your economic system.
So there's something I would like to read from the very first page, and this is the very first page that you, in your book, I believe, that you started, and this gives you a little bit impression of what Sicily was like at the time. And the paragraph goes like this. Someone who had just arrived might well believe that Sicily was the easiest and most pleasant place in the entire world. But if the traveler stays a while, he begins to read the newspaper and listen cheerfully. Bit by bit, everything changes around him. He hears that the guard of that orchard was killed with a rifle shot coming from behind that was because the owner hired him rather than someone else. Just over there, an owner wanted to rent his fruit as he saw fit, heard a bullet whistle pass his head in a friendly warning, and afterwards gave in. Elsewhere, a young man who had dedicated himself to setting up a nursery school in the outskirts of Palermo was shot at because certain people who dominate the common people in that area felt that by benefiting the poorer classes, he would acquire some of the influence on the population that they wanted to preserve exclusively for himself. The violence and the murders take the strangest form. There is a story about a former priest who became the crime leader in a town near Palermo and administered the last rites to some of his own victims. After a certain number of these stories, the perfume of orange and lemon blossoms started to smell of corpses. And that gives a kind of an idea of what Sicily was like.
Yeah, certainly in the late 19th century when that passage was written, but it felt a bit that way. What I then go on to describe is when I began doing some of the reporting for this book, I went to interview a prosecutor who had worked very closely with the people that I was planning on writing about. We had a very pleasant, long interview. He was somebody who had the reputation, who'd worked closely with these anti-mafia prosecutions and played a role in those prosecutions. And suddenly, a few days later, I pick up the Palermo newspaper and see that 3 or 4 judges are accused of a collusion with the mafia. This guy was among them. And then the next thing I know, a few days later, he commits suicide. So,
and you write as well in the paragraph a little bit later that you talked to someone in Sicily if you really trusted the guy, and it says he's dead, he's alive, ain't he? That if he's alive, he must be completed in mafia.
Yeah, which of course is not fair. Plenty of people are alive and not in collusion. But the point was that it's a world in which you don't quite know what to believe. And you're not sure, even to this day, I have no idea whether this particular judge was guilty of collusion with the mafia. He was never convicted. Oftentimes, people will spread rumors about somebody in order to, immobilize them and destroy their careers. So it's very hard to know. But the point was that I was trying to make a connection between these observations of Sicily in the late 19th century and the late 20th century, because there were points in common. It's a very, partly because of the secret nature of the mafia, you were often, as an outsider, at a loss to try to understand and interpret the way this world works. And one of the prosecutors I wrote about would sort of refer to, because the mafia doesn't talk about what it does, it speaks through code, it speaks through actions, it speaks through symbolic, a kind of symbolic language. And this prosecutor was particularly able in reading that code, and the mafiosi themselves are very good at reading those kinds of signals. One other point about that introduction about the beauty of Sicily, its orange groves and so on, is it is an exceptionally beautiful part of the world that was a sort of garden spot and was one of the granaries of the Roman Empire, a very productive agricultural area that nonetheless is very poor now. And so part of it is that it is a place of extreme contrasts. Palermo is still an extremely beautiful city. And if you look at photographs from the early 20th century, it has to have been one of the most beautiful cities in all of Europe, with gorgeous aristocratic villas and parks around them. Yeah. And then in the 1950s and 60s, Mafia interests played a role in bulldozing.
I want to go back a little bit before we get into the
Yeah.
50s with Mussolini and his grip on the mafia.
Yeah, sure. So to go back to the point about whether the mafia can be defeated and whether it is a kind of necessary evil, Mussolini made a point of combating the mafia, and he sent a prefect named Mori from Bologna to Sicily, and gave him extraordinary powers. Now Mussolini did this in part because the mafia represented a kind of competing power that Mussolini found intolerable. So it wasn't just a kind of noble motive of wanting to maintain rule of law. In Sicily, he cracked down on things like the Freemasonry for similar reasons. He wanted the fascist party to be the main, if not exclusive, source of power in the country. So having this kind of parallel state in Sicily that the mafia was not a tolerable thing for Mussolini. So he gave Mori these powers, and Mori used them often in a rather brutal and illegal, one would say, way. He would take suspected mafia members' families hostage and seize their property and things like that. He would arrest people with very limited proof and put them on trial. So it was a very rough and ready form of combating the mafia, but somewhat effective, because it's one of the kind of paradoxes of the mafia world that, on the one hand, it's a secret organization in which they don't publish their membership lists and they don't advertise their.
Or to join the mafiosi, come here.
Right. At the same time, to have power, people have to know who they are. So on a local level, it's this kind of thing where everybody knows what nobody knows. So in a local town, everybody knows who you don't want to piss off. Everybody knows who you don't want to, challenge to a fight or, rob their house, because there'll be real trouble for you. So it's this kind of thing of knowing and not knowing. So Mori took advantage of that by using, the common rumors about mafia members and just arresting them. So he did this for a period of years, and then was sent back to Bologna. It's not clear how effective this was. One of the, some of the studies of the war against the mafia during fascism shows that one of the effects of it was to lower wages in agricultural labor, and so that some people have argued that Mussolini's war against the mafia was simply doing a favor to wealthy landowners and helping them get rid of these kind of pesky, parasitical mafiosi who were eating into their profits. So that it didn't have, but many of these people who ended up actually playing an important role after World War II were sent to prison or into internal exile during the fascist period. So it disrupted mafia business to a degree. That ends up changing with World War II and the period after that.
And of course, we skip a huge part of the book, and if you haven't read this book yet, I would highly recommend that you do to get a deep dive into the mafia world and the war against the mafia. But so we just get the tip of the iceberg in this episode, I'm sure. But I want to go with after World War II, we get two new political parties in Italy that dominate the political agenda. and that would be the Christian Democrats and the Reds or the Communistic Party. And then if you know a little bit about the history in Italian modern history, you know that once it was mentioned Democrazia Christiania, of course it screams corruption. But what made the Christian Democrats so corrupt in the first place, and how did they get so much power after?
Well, I think it's important to take one step back to set the scene for the Christian Democrats. With the invasion of Sicily in 1943, when the Allies, mainly the Americans and the British, invade Sicily, they have the problem of, who to install in power. They want to get rid of the fascists, but they also don't want the communists coming to power. And so local powerful people, some of them mafiosi, some of them connected to the mafia, are likely candidates to fill that void. They were fought by the fascists, so they were not fascists, and they were certainly not communists. The mafia did a good job of infiltrating the Allied occupying force. One of the interpreters to the American Governor General in Sicily was an important mafia boss, Vito Genovese, of the Genovese crime family in New York. And a number of mafia figures were installed as mayors of towns. It's unclear how much the Americans knew about these mafia connections, but it's pretty clear that they didn't look very carefully at this or consider this as much of a problem. So you have these people who were in a position of power as World War II ends. And then you have the Cold War, in which the world looks like it's dividing between communism and American-backed capitalism. And the left wins a very big victory in local elections in Sicily in 1947. And then a Sicilian bandit named Salvatore Giuliano ends up killing dozens of Sicilian peasants who are celebrating his victory of the left. And so you see mafia figures or criminal figures operating as kind of political enforcers to help stave off the rise of socialist communist parties that are growing in the post-war period.
Now, the Communist Party was one of the biggest communist parties in Europe, right?
It was the biggest. It became the biggest. In 1947, the socialists were very big, but soon the Communist Party became the largest force of opposition in the country and the largest communist party in Western Europe. And so the U.S. was terrified of that. Conservative forces in Italy were terrified of that. And the Christian Democrats emerged as the most credible conservative party. They enjoyed the support of the Catholic Church, which was the strongest institution left standing after the collapse of fascism. And it's important to point out that not all of the people, like the main leader of the Christian Democratic Party, Alcide De Gasperi, was not a corrupt man. He was a very principled, honorable guy. But in places like Sicily, compromises were made. And so many people, and I spoke to somebody who was involved in these discussions at the time, where they were debating, do we let this or that person into the party? This person is rumored to be close to the mafia. This person is rumored to be in the mafia. And the general sense was, hey, look, the communists have their support from the Soviet Union. They have their tough guys. We need our tough guys if we're going to prevail and win. So they made a series of compromises at a local level, which people at a higher level decided to turn a blind eye to. And this then became a consolidated part of the way power was exercised in Sicily, and not only Sicily. One of the things that is important and relevant to this story and to post-war Italian history in general is that the Christian Democrats' dependence on these power bases in Sicily and southern Italy increases in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, so that in the immediate post-war period, they would, they were polling, let's say they could get, 40, 45% of the vote nationally. By the 1970s and late 70s and early 80s, their support in northern Italy is shrinking below 30%, but their support in southern Italy and Sicily is well above 50%. So suddenly they became much more dependent on these power bases in the south of the country, and therefore asking too many questions about who your supporters are in Sicily or Calabria or Naples is not a winning move if you're in the Christian Democratic Party. So, for example, one of the most egregious cases in the 1960s, the Italian Parliament conducted a big investigation into the Mafia, and the name of one of the mayors of Palermo, Salvatore Lima, was mentioned dozens of times in this report as being a politician especially close to the Mafia. During his time as mayor, an incredible number of building permits were issued to people who were basically just lending their name to Mafia firms that were tearing up the city and building, cheap high-rise apartments. And this politician, Salvatore Lima, then becomes a close confidant and lieutenant of Giulio Andreotti. Andreotti was a politician from Rome, had no connection to the Mafia, but he was a rising figure in the Christian Democratic Party. And to be a powerful figure in the Christian Democratic Party, he needed votes and he needed support in different parts of the country. He decides to make Lima a member of his entourage, and by doing so, that means when they hold a party congress, he has a lot of votes, and that allows Andreotti to be a powerful figure in the Christian Democratic Party, allows him to become prime minister 7 times, even though he personally may not have had anything to do with the Mafia. He's choosing not to look too closely at who Salvatore Lima is and who Salvatore Lima's friends back in Palermo are. So that's kind of the way the system worked.
So how much involvement did the Mafia have in Italian politics?
Well, that's a matter of dispute, but quite a lot. The fact is that for years, certain politicians pushed for legislation that would have made it much easier to combat the Mafia. Legislation similar to racketeering laws that exist in the United States, where the Mafia was also very present at that time. Laws that would allow you to convict somebody as a member of a criminal association rather than having to demonstrate that they pulled the trigger in a particular murder. It's a crime of association. There were laws, to create witness protection programs so that people who were part of these organizations could testify and acquire a measure of physical safety and impunity for testimony. The Italian state was very slow at adopting those measures, and the Christian Democrats opposed them for a long time, and they were only forced to pass those kind of laws after the level of killing that I describe in this book had reached kind of intolerable levels.
I think almost more people died in this book than in the Game of Thrones series.
Yeah, well, it was in some ways, it's not entirely unlike the story of the troubles in Northern Ireland. I mean, the numbers of killings were extensive. and the power struggle equally brutal.
Now, I want to almost as far as to go with the mention why the mafia kills and how they're choosing of who they kill. But would you call them terrorists in a way, that with the explosions, bombings, and the murders that they have committed? I would go as far as calling them terrorists at one point.
Well, what's interesting is that in the 1980s, they took a kind of quantum leap. In the past, the mafia was generally careful not to kill people in power because it brought a lot of heat down on them. They had killed some police officers in the 1960s that led to mass arrests, prosecutions, this anti-mafia commission report that I mentioned earlier, even though the convictions in those cases were never obtained, but it brought them a lot of heat. So they generally avoided killing police officers, prosecutors, politicians, and that changes in the late 1970s, early 1980s. It changes in part because the mafia in Sicily becomes immeasurably richer and more powerful than it had ever been before. You may have, and your listeners may have heard of the French Connection, which was made into a movie. It was about the heroin trade that went through Marseille, run by Corsican gangsters, and that brought heroin into Europe. The French Connection gets kind of shut down in the early 1970s, and the Sicilians move into the space that had been occupied by these Corsican gangsters, and they basically take over the heroin trade of Europe. And suddenly, police officials in Sicily become aware that something new is happening. They, for example, find suitcases full of dollars or of heroin on the luggage things in airports, and they realize that Sicily is becoming a center for the heroin trade. They begin looking for and eventually finding heroin refineries, drug refineries that are in Sicily, so that the Sicilians are actually refining heroin on their territory. Giovanni Falcone, one of the main characters of my book, very shrewdly, because in this period of the 70s, you couldn't get mafia people to talk to you. He begins realizing that the mafia, as it expands internationally, is having to depend on foreigners who are not as reliable and is not as bound by the laws of silence or omertà that the Sicilians are. So, he arrests a Belgian courier, they arrest a guy in France.
Yeah.
They question him, and they find out that, like, the French chemist that used to work for the French Connection is now working in Sicily for Cosa Nostra. So they begin to, the mafia has gone into the heroin business in a way that had never been before, and it is rich in a way that's never been before. There was one mafia witness who referred to something called the House of Money, La Casa dei Soldi, in which an entire apartment was just like filled with cash. They had so much cash they didn't know what to do with it. As they began conducting more sophisticated financial investigations in the 1970s, they began to realize how much property the mafia is now owning in places like Palermo, but not only in Palermo, and also investing in northern Italy and other parts of Europe. The mafia has changed its profile and become international, become rich beyond all imagining. And so at that point, they feel almost omnipotent, and the idea that some poorly paid police inspector in Palermo is going to interfere with their plans becomes an intolerable thing. So they murder one of the police inspectors who conducts one of these early investigations. They then murder his successor. and they begin kind of moving up the chain. They murder one of the prosecutors who signs off on one of the early mafia cases in the late 70s in Palermo. And so essentially they try to establish the principle of, if you mess with us, we'll kill you. Very simple. So don't mess with us. And so that forces them to kind of take a quantum leap and to begin to engage in, what you referred to as terrorist action, political killings. And that kind of escalates because there's...
Would you agree with my statement that it was an act of terrorism?
Yeah. So you see them killing more and more important as the state begins to send more and more resources at this problem. They have to keep escalating and killing more and more people and more important people. And so that's sort of one of the central plot lines of my book.
And of course, you mentioned Giovanni Falcone, and now I wanted to ask you about him. And with a name like Giovanni Falcone, it kind of sounds like a mafia name from a Hollywood movie, but in fact, it was complete opposite. It was fighting the mafia. So how did it come across to end up in Sicily as a judge, and how did he end up fighting the mafia? Because it wasn't really just intending to do it, so as you explained in the book.
Right. Well, he, first of all, it should be pointed out that only a minority of Sicilians end up in the mafia. Falcone was a Sicilian, which actually was, in a way, one of his great resources, one of the reasons why he was able to be successful. He grew up in a neighborhood of Palermo, La Calza, which had a heavy mafia presence. He went to school, as other people in the neighborhood did, with kids who would end up prosecuting or whose name would turn up in investigations. So he knew that world. This was a world in which, a kid whose uncle was a powerful mafia boss would, kind of strut and show off at school because he felt bigger and more important than other kids. So that was kind of the world he grew up in. But at the same time, there was a kind of Italian or Sicilian middle class, which was very law-abiding and patriotic, and Falcone was part of that, sort of Sicilian middle class. I think I remember, his sister telling me that, it was a point of pride that their father would never, waste money on ordering a cafe and a bar because that was sort of frivolous. And, so they're different kinds of Sicilians, and Falcone comes out of that. And so for people who didn't want to be compromised with those kind of power systems, becoming a magistrate is a good way to go because you're not in a business that can be shaken down by the mafia. It's a classic kind of career route for the middle class in a place like Sicily. So Falcone is a smart guy who majors in law, passes the exam to enter the magistrature, has no intention of being a mafia prosecutor, and in fact he ends up being assigned to the bankruptcy court in Palermo, and he learns how to conduct bankruptcy investigations, which ends up being incredibly lucky in terms of his later work because he learned how to conduct complicated financial investigations. And so when he then gets transferred over to the investigative office, at the time, the Italian judiciary divided the people that actually presented evidence at trial from the people that investigated investigations. So he was in the investigative office, and he decides to pick up a cold case of a mafia figure who had been murdered in the mid-1970s in Sicily, and they found a couple of checks on his person, including like a currency transfer and from a bank in Naples. And so Falcone says, rather than trying to find witnesses to this crime, what if we investigate this as a financial matter? And so he literally demands and impounds all the foreign currency transactions in Sicily for like a 5-year period. This is before their computers, I should point out. So they're having to literally go through thousands of pieces of paper and try to reconstruct financial relationships between certain people. It turns out that, this $25,000 currency transfer that was in the pocket of this gangster turns out to be from a Neapolitan gangster. So he begins to realize, wow, these people have financial connections between gangsters in Sicily and gangsters in Naples. He begins to discover that, these people are traveling to the United States at the same time when they're heroin shipments. They're trading money back and forth. And so before he has any kind of witnesses within the Sicilian Mafia, he's beginning to reconstruct the financial underpinnings of this world and manages to win an extraordinary number of convictions in the first major Mafia cases with no witnesses from that world. They're based on this financial data that he was able to acquire. So that was really key to the whole method that he used. It meant that his cases were much stronger and harder to overturn because they had a basis in financial documentation, other documentation, other than just the testimony of witnesses, which could be challenged in court.
Do you think the Mafia trials would have been the same if Falcone never had been involved in the Mafia trials? Do you think Sicily would look very different from what it does now without Falcone?
Hard to say. That sort of depends on your views of how history works. If you adopt the Tolstoyan view of history that it's not about individuals but about larger forces, there are other people that believe that, I would lead you to believe that other people would end up doing the kind of thing that Falcone did. But it should be said that the kind of methods that he innovated became methods that are now used throughout the magistrature in Italy. I think certainly it had a revolutionary effect on prosecutions in Sicily, and it also had a powerful effect on Sicily in general. The fact that Falcone and his close partner Paolo Borsellino were Sicilian, they were local people, I think changed the culture around the Mafia. If they had been people from northern Italy who were coming in and doing these prosecutions, local people might have instinctively sympathized with Mafia defendants rather than with the prosecutors. The fact that these people were risking their lives for the good of Sicilian society had a powerful effect on people and encouraged people to find the courage to come forward as witnesses.
Now, before we move on to Master Pesqueta, which I'm sure everyone expects, you know a little bit about Mafia, it's a bit criminal not to talk about him. But before we do so, I would like to talk about the P2 and what is the Mafia involvement and what does this have to do? What is the P2 and what does this have to do with the Mafia?
Okay, so the P2 Masonic Lodge was a secret Masonic lodge founded by a very strange individual named Lito Gelli. Gelli was a fervent fascist during the fascist period. He joined the Republic of Salo, which was the kind of puppet state that Mussolini set up with Hitler's help in northern Italy after the collapse of fascism. So only the really diehard fascists continued fighting after the fall of Mussolini, and Gelli was among them. He spent time in Argentina, where many fascists and Nazis ended up settling and had a relationship with Juan Perón. he had a mattress factory in Arezzo, Sicily, and Tuscany, and he put together this secret Masonic lodge in which he managed to recruit an astonishing number of powerful people, both within the Italian government and in Italian business. A lot of the people who were leading figures in the Italian secret services, generals in the Italian army, admirals, bank presidents, government ministers, the editor of the country's largest newspaper and its owner, Silvio Berlusconi, who was then its TV magnate, later to become prime minister, were all members of this association. There is debate about what the P2 did and what it meant, but clearly,
they tried to make a breakaway government of sorts.
yeah, I mean, what many people suspected was that it was almost like a kind of shadow government that would step in the event of a communist, coming to power. Clearly, it had a very sort of strong anti-communist thing, and Gelli wrote a paper which he called the Plan of Democratic Rebirth in Italy, which was a kind of presidential republic in which his people would be prominent. What is certainly true is that he had an undue amount of influence, and he had corrupted important parts of the state. People in the secret services were feeding him information, which he in turn could use to influence or blackmail people in power. The connection with the Mafia is an extremely interesting one, and comes out when your listeners may or may not remember who Michele Sindona was. Michele Sindona was a Sicilian banker who ended up becoming
the guy that kidnapped himself, right?
Pardon me? He eventually
The guy that kidnapped himself to try.
Yeah, he kidnapped himself. Yeah. So what happens is that Sindona has a bank in Italy, and he buys a bank in the United States. The bank in the United States goes belly up and bankrupt, and it leads to an investigation into fraud. Sindona is in all sorts of trouble, and then his Italian bank is in receivership, and Sindona is putting a lot of pressure on Italian politicians to whom he's given money to save him from bankruptcy, and it's not working. And the inspector who is liquidating his bank in Milan is especially intransigent and refuses to back this rescue plan. As a result, Sindona hires an American gangster to first threaten and then kill this bank inspector. So that happens in, I think, 1979. Sindona, after that, disappears because everyone suspects it's pretty obvious who has commissioned this professional hit on this poor bank inspector. So Sindona goes missing, and he claims that he's been kidnapped by terrorists. He is then spirited back from New York, where he disappears, where he's been living in a fancy New York hotel. And people in the American Mafia and the Sicilian Mafia, who are in fact first cousins, managed to spirit him back into Italy, and he spends 3 months in hiding, pretending to be kidnapped and issuing various statements that sort of echo the kind of statements that hostages in, being held by the Red Brigades or something would make. But clearly they were sort of fairly transparent blackmail threats directed at people in power in Italy. If you don't give us what we want, I will have to tell everything I know about, this and that. Finally, Sindona realizes that it's not working, and he ends up being sent back to the United States under a false name, and then he gets a doctor who's been helping him hide, shoot him in the leg so that it looks as if he's been injured trying to escape. All of that was staged. So this whole thing, so at a certain point during Sindona's fake kidnapping, police are watching out for a courier to deliver one of these ransom requests to Sindona's lawyer in Rome. And they arrest this guy who turns out to be the nephew of one of Palermo's biggest construction companies and somebody who is a first cousin of one of Palermo's biggest mafia bosses, who is also one of Giovanni Falcone's main defendants. So suddenly they realize that...
How did they discover that this was a fake kidnapping? Does he confess, or does he...
Well, it just becomes totally obvious. He's been, when they eventually begin to figure it out, one, his story never made any sense. And they then discover that he's been, dining at fancy restaurants in Palermo with Don Gambino of the Gambino crime family. He's been staying in a fancy hotel in Catania, the bill being paid by one of Catania's, main construction companies, which is Mafia connected. So all the pieces begin to come together. They realize that Sindona is deeply embedded in the world of the Sicilian Mafia and the world of the American Mafia. One of the things they find is that in the pocket of this doctor who shoots Sindona in the leg to help him, mimic a real kidnapping, they find a ticket to Arezzo. And so what is a Sicilian doctor doing going to Arezzo? He says, I went to see my dentist, which of course was a little hard to believe. Eventually, he's forced to admit that he's gone to see this man named Licio Gelli, the head of the P2 Masonic Lodge. So at that point, the investigation of Falcone and the investigation of prosecutors in Milan who are investigating Licio Gelli suddenly cross. And so, in fact, Falcone is in Milan on the day of, I think it's March 1981, in which police raid the offices of Licio Gelli in Arezzo. And they discover these membership lists that have about 950 names on it that I said contains many of the most powerful people in Italy. And so this becomes an enormous scandal. The government falls because even ministers of the government are on this list. What are all these people doing, sort of swearing loyalty to this neo-fascist with a secret Masonic lodge? So that's the connection, but it's clear that some part of that Sindona's banking empire, the P2 and the Mafia are all connected in some way. In the case of the Mafia, as I mentioned before, the Mafia is making money on a scale it's never made before. It needs to recycle that money. So it begins investing millions of dollars in looking to launder it through banks like Sindona's, banks like the Ambrosiano Bank, which is a bank that Licio Gelli controls indirectly through Roberto Calvi, who is the director of that bank. And there have long been suspicions that the Sicilian Mafia was also among the biggest early investors in Berlusconi's TV empire. So you see that these things all end up, sort of converging in the P2, where many of these interests end up colliding.
And our next character, to be run only a chance to, unfortunately, can't go through the entire book, but I'm going to try to pick out the most important parts of your book, as I said before. And one of the main characters is also a named man called Tommaso Buscetta, which perhaps I would say, by understanding Buscetta, And there's a Netflix special, not that special, but a documentary which goes about his life after the Maxi trial, famous Maxi trial, which I would highly recommend to see as well after this episode. But how important is he to Mafia prosecution and the Maxi trial in itself, and what makes him want to talk to
Well,
and be
so
be to the police?
Buscetta is an important person because although he was not the head of a major mafia family, he was
But sort of the boss of two worlds.
yeah, he was a major figure, and he was very close to a lot of important people in the mafia. He clearly had a long experience in the heroin trade. He divided his time between Sicily and South America. He married a Brazilian woman at a certain point. And he was very close to a lot of the leaders of the old Palermo Mafia families who end up getting wiped out and exterminated by Salvatore Riina and the Mafia of Corleone, which become dominant in the late 70s, early 80s. So Buscetta, as the Corleonese Mafia began hunting down and killing the people who are important in the main Palermo Mafia families, they began hunting for Buscetta, and they kill a lot of Buscetta's relatives, an astonishing number of them, including children of his who have nothing to do with the Mafia at all. So Buscetta is on the run, and he's somewhere in South America, and police in Brazil arrest him. They extradite him to Italy. He actually tries to kill and poison himself before he returns to Italy. They save his life. He's brought back to Italy. And interestingly, he begins to be questioned by Giovanni Falcone, and Falcone is actually able to get him to talk. That's
And I want to ask, because if anyone is familiar with, crime and the ordinance crime, when you talk to the police, it's considered a rat. Would you say he was a rat, or would you?
Well, that would have been that the Sicilians would have used the term infame, which is a traitor. And so yes, but remember, this is a person whose children have been murdered, whose I think over a dozen of his relatives were hunted down and killed. So at a certain point, the old rules about
you can understand why you choose to tell.
Yeah. So this is a person who is, his only possibility of revenge is by talking. And so he begins to talk to Falcone, and because he's had access to some of the most powerful people in the Mafia, a couple of heads of major Mafia families, Buscetta was considered to be highly intelligent. And so even though he didn't have a leadership role, people at the highest level consulted him, talked to him, shared their thoughts with him. And he was able, as a result, to describe the leadership structure of the Mafia in a way that no other witness had been able to do before. There were hardly any witnesses anyway. So Buscetta explains to Falcone that there's actually a decision-making process in Cosa Nostra. The Cosa Nostra is a hierarchical organization.
This is the first time we get to hear the word Cosa Nostra and confirm that the Mafia is a real thing.
Well, he knew it was a real thing, but no one quite knew that there was a decision-making process with a clear hierarchy. And so that, for example, the Mafia would not consider killing a police inspector or a prosecutor without the commission, the heads of the Mafia, signing off on it and agreeing to that. So what it does is it allows Falcone to make the case that the Mafia is a hierarchical organization like a corporation, in which you could hold the CEO or the board of directors responsible for things that the company does, and that the mafia functions in a way that is somewhat analogous to that. And so that becomes a crucial piece of the architecture of this big case that Falcone and his colleagues bring in the mid-1980s, known as the Maxi trial of Palermo.
How long does the interrogation of Bruschetta go?
Several weeks, and then continues on for years. You often, what happens is you have to go back to a witness when you've learned later things. So they talk on and on for years, but the important stuff is over a period of weeks.
Now, the Maxi trial itself is, how many does get prosecuted, or how does the Maxi trial go? And if you're interested, there is, again, clips on YouTube, and you get to recognize some. I was watching them after I was reading about the Maxi trial, and then you do recognize some of the dialogue you put in the book as well when you watch the clips on YouTube. But how does the Maxi trial proceed?
So they do something really unprecedented in the Mafia trial, in which they indict over 400 people in one case. They're essentially indicting the whole organization, its leadership structure, and hundreds of its members at the same time, on the theory that this is a unitary organization that functions as an organization.
Cut off the head of the snake and the rest.
Right. Well, and a lot of the body as well. So again, it's based partly on Bruschetta's testimony, but also on all this other stuff, the financial data they have, and all these relationships that they built over a period of many years. And in order to conduct this trial, they actually have to build a massive courtroom, which is almost like the size of a sports stadium.
So this is built specifically for the Maxi trial,
Built
right?
specifically for this. It still exists right in the center.
Is it still used, or is it?
Yeah, it's still used. So it's a little too big for most trials, but there was room for 400 plus defendants in cages, and an audience to attend, and judges and witnesses and so forth. So this trial took place, and took about a year to conduct, and ended up leading to an extremely high number of convictions, and was really revolutionary because they were able to hold many of the heads of Cosa Nostra responsible for many of its worst crimes. It should be stressed that some of the lead defendants, the people at the top of the pyramid, were tried in absentia because they were fugitives of justice. Somebody like Salvatore Rina, who was believed to be the boss of bosses, was not at the Maxi trial, but he was convicted. Michele Greco, who was also one of the members of the commission, however, was at the trial. But it was remarkably successful, both in terms of obtaining convictions, but also, I think, of respecting basic rule of law. There was something like 120 people who were acquitted because of insufficient proof. Interestingly, a number of those people were gunned down and killed almost as soon as they were released from prison. So clearly, they were obviously guilty. They were obviously mafia members who had enemies in the organization, but there wasn't sufficient proof to convict them in trial. So it was a great triumph. But then the war against the mafia kind of took a step backward after that.
So what does this mean for the career of Falcone? Does it step up? Because like part of the book, it seems like it should have gone the other direction than it did, and he should have had been a career booster from Falcone being able to.
You would have thought that somebody who had engineered such an incredible triumph would have been made Minister of Justice or placed in charge of mafia cases.
Instead, it goes rather in the opposite direction.
Yes, instead it worked in the opposite way. So what happens is, after the trial was over, Falcone's boss, who was a man named Antonino Caponnetto, who was an older magistrate, decides to retire. And he received assurances from the body that governs the Italian magistrature that Falcone would succeed him.
That would be a dream job for Falcone, right?
As the head of the Palermo office, the anti-mafia pool of Palermo. Instead, they double-cross him, and the Consiglio Superiore della Magistratura, the governing body of the Italian magistrature, picks somebody else for the job, a guy who has no background in prosecuting the mafia, and who is very skeptical about these big kind of prosecutions.
Would that be Moreno Melli?
Pardon me?
Moreno Melli?
Yes, Melli. So prosecutions of mafia cases kind of grind to a halt, and Falcone then is very frustrated and unhappy. And all sorts of other strange things happen, like somebody begins sending anonymous letters to various people accusing Falcone of sort of dirty dealings. These things are not true, but they have to be investigated. So Falcone suddenly finds himself being called up before the governing body of the magistrature and having to defend himself. He's fully exonerated, but meanwhile, here's this person who should be, held up to a position of...
He should be a hero of the country.
Is now like having to defend himself. And I remember it was in that period when I began thinking, I remember when I was in Italy during the summer in which those hearings were taking place, and I knew enough about the mafia phenomenon at that point to think this story is going to end very badly. And
Melli is already kind of pissed off because he as well got threats that I think believes Falcone is the one that sends the threats, right? And it doesn't go well for the Mafia Commission at all after the Master trial.
No, and so eventually, in frustration, Falcone ends up leaving Palermo and taking a job working for the Minister of Justice at the time, a man named Claudio Martelli, that many people back in Palermo see as a very strange compromise on Falcone's part. Why would you go leave Palermo? You're abandoning your job. Martelli and the Socialist Party that he was a part of were considered to be corrupt, not particularly enthusiastic about the war on the mafia. But Falcone has made a very shrewd move in which he succeeds in sort of winning this minister, Martelli, over to his side. And Martelli ends up pushing through a series of legislative reforms that Falcone has been urging, the creation of a kind of super prosecutor's office in Rome that would oversee organized crime investigations in all of Italy, and things of that kind. And then he uses his influence in Rome to the Maxi trial. Italy, as you may know, allows for 3 levels of adjudication, so that even if you've been convicted of a crime, you are not definitively convicted until 2 more appeals courts have signed off on the conviction. And so this Maxi trial...
Doesn't a lot of mafia go free as well?
So the mafia has benefited from this because they have a good friend on Italy's highest court who has chosen to review many of the most important mafia cases. And he was a man named Cordova who was known as the sentence killer. It's unclear what this man's motivation was, but he would always seem to find some small technical violation in mafia cases that he would use to overturn these convictions. And so the mafia was counting on this guy overturning the convictions in the Maxi trial case. And Falcone uses his presence in Rome and the influence that he's gaining to force this man, Cordova, not to review the Maxi trial. And so the case goes to a different panel of judges to review. The convictions are upheld in its final appeal. And that seems to seal his death and the death of several other people. The Mafia, according to various Mafia witnesses, is furious that these convictions have been upheld, and they decide that the people they hold responsible will pay. And so in March of 1992, they murder Salvatore Lima, who was then Prime Minister Andreotti's man in Sicily, which I remember at the time was very, very puzzling. Like, why would the Mafia kill a politician who was rumored to be one of their closest allies in power? We now know it was because they were expecting Lima to use what influence he had in Rome to get the Maxi trial overturned. They then kill an important businessman in Sicily named Salvo, who was supposed to be very close to the Mafia. Again, very puzzling. No one could understand why they would kill people who were close to them this way. And then they killed Falcone, and it started to become more clear.
So I want to talk about the death of Falcone. Before I want to talk about, isn't this where he creates the Italian FBI as well, when he just sent to Rome? Or how did you mentioned talk about a little bit about the Italian, how the Italian sort of version of FBI was made?
Right. Well, they set up. I mean, they set up an office in Rome known as the Super Procura, which still exists, which is a way of coordinating organized crime cases. It makes a lot of sense because these groups have relationships between one another, and having a centralized database for the information. You know, in other words, criminals in Calabria and Sicily are sending people up to, you know, Milan and Turin to invest in legal businesses and to buy up businesses and things like that. So information is gathered in cities in northern Italy, end up being extremely useful to investigations, you know, of crime groups in other parts of the country. So that's the logic behind it, and it makes a lot of sense, and it's worked, I think, reasonably well. You know, so it's just a form of coordination, but cases are still handled locally by local prosecutors as well.
So how abruptly does the death of Falcone happen? How abruptly is it?
Well, you know, it was really breathtaking and heartbreaking. You know, I remember it very vividly when it happened. It just sort of, I mean, what was awful is you know, to bring it back to your memory, they blew up like 100 yards of highway in order to kill this man. They killed, I think it was 7 people, driving in cars at high speed from just out near the Palermo airport. And so it was an expression of power on the part of the Sicilian Mafia. Like, there is nobody we can't kill, and we can even blow up an entire highway in order to do it. So on the one hand, it was incredibly painful and poignant. He was also killed with his wife and his bodyguards. It was an awful, awful business. At the same time, you know, then almost immediately after his death, you know, his close friend and collaborator, Paolo Borsellino, was then mentioned very prominently as taking up his place and being the next candidate to be the head of the so-called Super Procura, this national mafia investigation unit. And people felt that this was then placing Borsellino at risk. And then in July of 1992, Borsellino is killed by a car bomb in Palermo when he is visiting his mother, whom I later interviewed in her home. And
Yeah, I remember.
And so the reaction of many people, for example, Antonio Caponnetto, who is their boss, was quoted after Borsellino's death saying, "It's finished, it's all over, it's finished. Everything is finished." But somebody like Buscetta, who was then questioned by a magistrature, said, actually, the mafia is in trouble. They wouldn't do this if they weren't, this is a sign of weakness and not of strength. They're obviously feeling cornered. And so then, as mafia witnesses begin coming forward to talk in unprecedented numbers, that intuition proves to be correct, that it gradually emerges that these killings are the result of the convictions in the Maxi trial. The Maxi trial had been extremely effective. Falcone's death and Borsellino's death were an indication of how effective they had been. And the state is so embarrassed by the fact that the two people who should have been among the most protected people in the country were allowed to be killed, forces the Italian state to react in a way that it had never reacted before. They send 7,000 army troops to Sicily to secure the area. What this meant is that a lot of these troops were simply guarding the houses of judges and police officials, which at least freed up ordinary police officers to do what they're supposed to do, which is police work. So it ended up greatly lowering crime in all of Sicily, and I'm happy to say that the level of crime has stayed down.
I want to ask you about this. What is Sicily like today compared to?
I haven't been back in the last few years, but it's gotten much, much better. I mean, I remember the first trips that I took to Sicily. People felt very insecure on the street in the evening, and in recent years, that's not been the case at all. So that's very good. People in Palermo have taken back their streets, so that's very good.
It's still a strong mafia presence, or is it not?
It's still a strong mafia presence, but not as strong as it was. What happened is that the mafia, Cosa Nostra in Sicily, got hit very, very hard. And what it meant is it created an opportunity for the gangsters of Naples and Calabria to fill the void. So they did. Mafia in Calabria right now is considered to be the most powerful.
What would you say is the legacy of Falcone?
Well, I think the legacy is that he demonstrated that with hard work and political will, the mafia can effectively be combated. One of the things that Falcone said that I always found very moving and quite profound in its simple way was he said, the most revolutionary thing you could do in Sicily is apply the law. And so I think he showed that the law can be applied and that it can improve the lives of ordinary people. And so I think that to me is the real lesson.
Thank you so much for coming. It was a pleasure to have you on. And
okay.
And before you go, do you have anything you wish to promote on the social media that you wish to plug in the description?
No, of course. I urge people to read my book, Excellent Cadavers. I think it holds up quite well.
It's definitely a page turner, and I would highly recommend people to read it as well.
So, other than that, they're welcome to follow me on Twitter. I don't tend to tweet that much about organized crime these days, but anyway, I am on Twitter.
So, where can people buy your book if they're interested?
Well, probably easiest place is Amazon, whatever feelings one may have about the empire of Jeff Bezos, but it's available pretty widely in places that are, where it's easy to get books online. So.
Thank you very much for coming. And
Okay.
my name is Alan. This has been well.h12. We are available on Instagram under well.h12. Please consider rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts if you wish. You don't have to. It doesn't have to be 5 stars, but please consider rating us. If you like this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. We are available wherever you can find us: YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.